Hi, Lynette. I'm so happy to have a chance to talk to you. I think you know I'm a big fan of this book. I don't know a rights person who isn't a fan of this book because we don't have a lot of other references. In fact, maybe we have no other books that are as useful as yours. So thank you for that. And let's get right into it. I thought maybe the place to start was talking about how this is the 9th edition. And way back when, how did you get started with this?
Well, just reflecting on that, the genesis of selling rights, I remember very clearly what triggered it. It was back in 1989, so we're actually talking about 35 years ago. And what sparked it off was a remark made by one of the great, I suppose, grande dame of rights at the time, Katerina Zarnecki, who worked for Macmillan US. And we were on the Frankfurt Advisors panel, and this didn't come up during a meeting. I think it came up when we were walking away from a meeting and talking about the resources that were available for younger people wanting to go into rights and how few formal resources there were. And Katerina said, of course, you couldn't write a book about rights, really, could you? And the conversation continued, but I went away and thought about that. And I thought, well, I'm going to give it a try. And so I embarked upon it. And the first edition was published in 1991, since when it's been on a 4-year revision cycle. It was published by a rather specialist imprint called Blueprint, which was part of Chapman and Hall, Taylor and Francis. And I suppose it was a loose series of books for the publishing industry. There was one on commissioning, there was one on publishing law, there was one on marketing, and the longest lived one has been Inside Book Publishing by Giles Clark and Angus Phillips, and that's going into a 7th edition later this year. But that's been reconfigured much more as a textbook for publishing degree students, whereas mine is mainly intended for people working in the profession, but is used by publishing degree students as well. So that's how it started. And I find it extraordinary that it's continued for so long. I've got a copy of the first edition here. Perhaps I can hold it up. And it has this wonderful subtitle, A Publisher's Guide to Success. No longer has the subtitle. About 250 pages long. And the current edition, the new one, which is just published, is double the size. It's 550 pages long. So over the years, like Topsy, it's growed and growed because our business has changed a lot. So that's really what triggered it, Katerina's remark all those years ago.
Yeah, I mean, nothing like a challenge, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's doubled in size, and I think that really does have to do with how many things have changed since we were in rights back in 1989. At this point is for you to talk about all the things that are new in this edition. So it's 4 years later. Is it 3 or 4? 4.
It's about just over 4. Yes.
Yeah.
In fact, the previous edition came out about 6 months before the launch of ChatGPT, which of course is significant. I mean, there was no thought last time round about AI and the impact it would have on contracts and also on various aspects of licenses. So when I came to prepare for the new edition, in fact, I think I signed the contract with Routledge the day before ChatGPT was launched. And my intention was mainly to cover the impact of COVID on working practice, because obviously that has changed a lot of things. Working from home, hybrid working, effect on book fairs, and in particular, presentation of rights online. I mean, the use of Zoom, Teams, and so on, which has continued very much after COVID, I think. I think a lot of rights professionals will say that they're still more inclined to use it because they got used to using it during the time when we were all working from home. So that was my intention, to try and work that through in the various areas of the book where it was relevant. But of course, when AI came into being, that was a whole new ballgame. And rather than, I didn't feel that it was best treated in a separate chapter, but rather that it was flagged initially in the copyright chapter at the beginning, because obviously it has massive impact on copyright and the ownership of whatever comes out of AI, and the fact that the big tech companies have been using content without permission thus far, although licenses are now being signed. But then it affects author contracts because on both sides. Should authors be restricted from using AI? Should publishers be restricted from using AI or allowing their licensees to use AI? And then it affects, in particular, translations. Should those be by humans or by machine? Audio narration, and to some extent, film and television rights, because that was one of the reasons for the strike. With artists and screenwriters afraid of AI impacting on their work. So that was quite a challenge. And of course, as fast as I wrote, things kept changing. So whatever I've written on AI, things have moved on since the book even came out in July.
Yeah, it's true. So I really like that you didn't somehow try to treat AI as a separate issue, because that's not where it works. I mean, it's everywhere in our lives now, and we don't really again, as you said, because it's moving so quickly, we don't know where all that's going to end up, but it's better to make sure we're reminded as we're going through all of our processes, what's the impact of AI here. You did cover a lot of the impact of the pandemic, and I think that's helpful for people to understand that although the pandemic was devastating in some ways, in many ways, personally, and in terms of humanity, we gained tools that we can now use that improve things. And in some ways, not all of our old publishing practices are back to where they were. I mean, we don't necessarily have, for example, at Frankfurt Book Fair, all of our Asian customers visiting us. I know many people are still doing Zoom calls with publishers because they're not going to have an opportunity to meet in person. There are other things, of course, throughout. I know that you've updated, including you're always good about mentioning market changes. Again, I'm a little bit focused on translation rights since my Frankfurt schedule is right here. I'm thinking about Frankfurt. You brought in information about the Middle East and
yes, I mean, Ukraine. Understandably, there have been a lot of political situations which have affected rights trading, and I mean that's Russia and Ukraine, obviously, and also the current and very distressing situation in the Middle East. And I think I've also mentioned questions of censorship. I mean, we're used to dealing with censorship in markets like China and Vietnam and Russia, although things are pretty much on hold in Russia at the moment. But I think what's been sad for me is someone who entered the Eastern European markets very early. I first went to Poland in the 1970s, and to what was then the Soviet Union in the 1980s. But I would say things have moved backwards in some of those markets. I mean, markets which became very liberated after the fall of communism in terms of content actually are closing up, and a number of topics on publication, particularly LGBTQ issues, for example, are being clamped down on. So there's that, and of course, there is also the question of books being removed from libraries in the USA. So it's not purely a continental or Asian problem.
Right. I think
licensing, of course.
Yeah. The sort of ways to figure out what a publisher can and can't do in their territories is part of being a good licensor, right? Being able to pitch books to people, letting them know when there might be sensitivities, and trying to see what's possible. And I appreciate that you bring up the horrible practice now here in many states of book banning and where we are with that. And of course, we're all trying to go against that. The publishing industry's making great efforts to make it clear to the American people why book bans are bad. but you can't help but wonder if it begins to have an effect on what people publish. Go into, but in the film and TV business, we now have the streaming services. I know you had to update some things in the electronic chapters. These are, I guess I like to bring all these pieces up because maybe somebody owns the previous edition, but in fact, lots of things have changed and it does affect our daily working.
Yes, I think services in particular meant that I had to update quite considerably the film and television chapter. And I've been very fortunate in that Julian Friedman from the Blake Friedman Agency has always been kind enough to cast his eye over that chapter, because obviously it's not something where I have day-to-day hands-on experience. What I do try to do also is to update examples to give a lot of sense of the type of projects which get turned into film and television adaptations. And of course, the streaming services have opened up a lot more opportunities for that. Although, again, the strike put a lot of things on hold.
Yeah.
But I mean, channels that we didn't have when the last edition came out have opened up. And I've tried to give as up-to-date examples as I can for both film, terrestrial television, and the streaming services. That's quite a lot of work. What I tend to do when I'm looking forward to the next edition is keep information from edition to edition on every chapter. So that means tracking new films coming out that are based on books, television series, and so on. And then I'm trying to put it all together when I get to that chapter. I've done the same for radio readings, which of course is a particular feature here in the UK. We're very lucky to have BBC programs which feature Book at Bedtime, Book of the Week, and so on, where there are edited solo readings of books, which are enormously beneficial in terms of publicity. So I try to update the examples of those as well.
Yeah, I love that. We could move from this right into my next topic, which is, I'm over here on this side of the pond. A lot of what we do as rights people is common, is the same on both sides. If we're selling translation rights, there's so much we do that's the same. But in other types of rights, the opportunities are very different. When I read, for example, your chapter on serial rights, I'm always struck by how great it would be if we had newspapers that wanted to pay good money for serial rights,
well,
which
I think
we don't
probably
have so much over here.
Yes, I think even here people would yearn for the good old days when the money was very much larger. I mean, Mrs. Thatcher was reputed to have received £1 million for serial rights in her memoir. Gone are those days. I mean, the money is much more modest. But just looking at my regular weekends papers, Saturdays and Sundays, you'll find probably 5 or 6 extracts across the papers which I take, probably done for a few £100s in some cases, but again, enormous publicity value for the publishers and the authors concerned.
Yes. And I know over here, very often it's the rights team and the publicity team working together, usually rights going in first because we're used to asking for money, and publicity is used to asking for favors, not to dismiss that.
Yes, that's so, a delicate balance.
Yeah. But it does have such an impact when it's timed correctly to hit, when a book is about to hit in a bookstore. You can just drive the readership right in there with the right kind of excerpt. And then I know I said to you, I thought everything was common between US, UK in terms of licensing translation rights. In fact, this book, could be used by someone who's in France, licensing French translation rights out. I mean, it gives some insights into
I've tried
how to proceed.
Yes, I've tried in the practical chapters. I mean, this would be sort of from 3 to 8 up to coverage of book fairs. I think those are fairly universal. But of course, the one thing to say is that, both the industry on your side of the Atlantic and mine have the advantage of publishing in English. And that's an enormous advantage when you're selling rights, because wherever you send information or material, in almost every publishing house in every country, there's going to be someone who's going to be able to assess that material if it's in English.
Yes.
If you're a rights seller publishing in another language, you may immediately have a barrier. I mean, if you're a Japanese publisher and want to offer your rights to a German publisher,
yes,
you've got immediately got a language obstacle. And maybe this is something, of course, where AI might come in to produce some sample material in a common language, which of course is likely to be English, that could be used for assessment. And maybe that's not such a bad thing. It's really full-scale translations for publication that I think one would worry about being done by AI.
Yeah, we see examples of why AI doesn't work. You can ask AI how many R's are in strawberry, and it still says 2 instead of 3. But we're not looking for AI to help us spell necessarily. That's not the thing. I know some rights people, even in English language houses, are contemplating and perhaps even practicing translating their rights guides into another language via AI, and trying to see how that works, and does that help their customers say, when I'm going to the Beijing Book Fair, is an advantage for me to also have it in Chinese, simplified Chinese, because it will enable even more people in a publishing company to understand what's on offer.
Yes. I think recommending producing material for non-English publishers, producing at least publicity material or rights guide in English, I would always recommend. I was running a course in Latvia back in July, and I would always say, it sounds like sort of doing an advertisement for English, but that is a language which will travel the world, and it's worth making the investment of actually producing material, and perhaps sample chapters in English to overcome that barrier.
Yes. I think that's really always good advice too. What else do we need to hit on to make sure that everybody understands? I mean, I can only say, after I've practiced rights a long time, but I still run up on things that I don't do daily or don't do regularly, or people are seeking advice on things that deals they want to make, and I point them to those chapters because they're very useful. You can really follow through and get the perspective, even to the point of really understanding what's important in negotiation. What are the points in each type of deal that you need to focus on?
I hope it's helpful. Of course, one of the things that sometimes is said is you don't give definitive guidelines on terms, but of course that's a very dangerous thing to do. And I suppose my thinking is the terms should reflect the market circumstances. You can't set them in stone. You need to take into account the situation of the potential licensee in the market concerned. What pricing is like, what they're prepared to pay. It makes no sense to pluck large sums of money out of the air which the licensee couldn't possibly earn back. So it's better to be realistic. The other thing which has often been said is, why are there no contracts in the book?
Yes.
And I mean, I think that's a major thing. First of all, it would make the book about 3 times the size. And I think for some types of licensing, you could provide a contract. For others, it would be much harder because they vary enormously. But the key element there really is that I've always said, here in the UK, we put those contracts into a completely different book, and I flag that up in the introduction. And that's Clark's Publishing Agreements, which I know you, Chris, are familiar with, which is an enormous book, which I can barely lift to show. Currently in its 11th edition, and this has 26 precedents with accompanying notes, including things like author contracts, translation licenses, a number of electronic licenses, and so on. And that is very heavily used by small publishers who don't have in-house contract departments or legal counsel. And we're just about to start thinking about the next edition, because again, this edition preceded AI. That's going to start to affect contractual wording. But I think for that reason, quite apart from the question of size, it wouldn't make sense to try to put it into the contracts into the rights book.
Yeah, I agree. I do like Clark's as well, and I use it again, even though it's from a perspective of UK copyright practice and Berne Convention versus US. There's still so much that's useful. And depending on where you're sitting, you know, you may be working in a house that has a long history of making deals and precedents in your own company, so you're not necessarily looking for a template. However, what's interesting about that book is it can explain things that are probably in your template. And listen, contracts evolve too, right? We are approached by customers all the time who are saying things like, can we please change this clause to reflect today's reality? And you have to sort of have some knowledge of why was that in there originally.
Yes,
you know,
I think a lot of the value is you can download there's a website for downloading the precedents, but the explanatory notes, I think, are a huge part of the value of the book. And it's particularly used by small publishers. I mean, I work a lot with the Independent Publishers Guild over here, and they're very often one-man bands, and you know, are at a loss to if they have to deal with a contract for the first time. So they use it as a resource. So it's great to know.
Yes, I think that's. I also want to mention always when I'm thinking about rights, I grew up in publishing companies, you grew up in publishing companies, but our brothers and sisters in agencies, literary agencies, are often, you know, there's often a designated person there who's handling rights, not representing authors necessarily, but handling rights to those books as they go beyond their primary contracts into translation, into audio, into even permissioning for estates and those kind of things, where, you know, it's a useful tool for them too. Their operations are very much like an in-house rights department.
Yes, I've been heartened to have some direct feedback on the new edition from agents, and it's good to know that they use it as well, because you know, often there's a slight tension, I think, between rights people working in publishing houses and literary agents. I mean, I've worked mainly in academic publishing, where one doesn't encounter them as much as one would in trade publishing. But I've tried to take their perspective into account as well. As I said, Julian Friedman has been very helpful on things like the film and television chapter.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, unless you have something else specific you want to mention from the book, I think we're pretty much at the end of our conversation. I think, you know, you've done a phenomenal job, and I know in the rest of your life you're also doing a tremendous amount of training people and helping them to understand rights practices, and we're all just grateful for that.
Well, thank you, Chris. It's good to know that both the books are of practical help.
Yes. Thanks. Our mysterious world of rights, now somewhat explained, thanks to you.
Every editor should read it, perhaps.
That's true. That would be a helpful thing if more people, more of our colleagues understood really what we're aiming for and why they can help with that. Would be fantastic. All right.
Thanks, Chris.
Here's to rights forever.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Thanks, Lynette. Bye.
Bye.